Right, and let's go. So, very glad to see you all. I think, we probably have this week and next week left in the book of Deuteronomy. I think we're going to finish today chapter 31, and then we will have 32 and 33 left, which are both poetry. And then following that, we will be starting the book of Joshua. So in terms of our study of the book of Joshua, you just need, it's of course not in the Chumash, so you're going to need a copy of a Tanakh, a Bible, because there you'll find the next section. If you want, there is a wonderful English translation. Robert Alter, who's really done a magnificent modern translation. Now, I believe that he has a translation you can get just probably of Joshua, maybe Joshua and Judges. The other thing is he has a 3-volume translation of the entire Bible, and the second volume, which is called Prophets, which includes all of this Joshua on, is called Former Prophets, the early prophets, and then the latter prophets, who are all people like Jeremiah and Isaiah and those people. So next, probably in 3 weeks, 2 weeks from today, we'll start Joshua. Just grab a copy where you can. All right. Okay. So Vayelech is its own parsha. It is the last parsha of the Torah, which is actually read in synagogue on Shabbat morning. I'm sorry, Vayelech is the second to last, right? So next week we'll have the last read in the synagogue, and following that is the very end of the Torah, which is not read in the synagogue on Shabbat morning. It's read at Simchat Torah, and that's where things end. Okay, so we're looking at chapter 31. If you have Eitz Chaim, it's page 1173.
Hi.
1173.
I'm on the video now.
Leah, why don't you mute?
I'm okay after 12, okay?
Okay, so 1173. And Moses spoke all of these things to the people of Israel, and he said, and he starts out by telling them, I am 120 years old. So the idea of 120 is an important number. It is, according to the early section of the book of Genesis, the oldest that a person can live. Right? Now, it's not entirely consistent. We do see people living longer. I think Abraham lives longer than 120. I don't remember exactly how old he is. And these may be variant traditions, but the tradition in the early part of Genesis is 120. That's after all those very long-lived people like Methuselah and others. And it's interesting to note that this idea, the idea that a person would only live to 120, is also found in Sumerian documents. The Sumerians were people who were around at the time of the ancient Israelites. The interesting thing about the Samaritans, and Sandy, you might find this interesting in particular because it's mathematical, right? They did not use a base 10 system the way we do. In other words, 1 through 10, and then 11 is essentially 10-1, 10-2, right? So their system was based on 60, which is really quite something. right? It's base 60. And so this would be twice that. And they too seem to view this as the limit for human longevity, which is why it's customary to say to people, ad mea ve'esrim, until 120. Somebody celebrates a birthday, right? And you say to them, Mazel tov to 120, right? You want them to live a full life, or I think more appropriately, to 120 in good health, right? Because at a certain point, I hate to say it, but it's not worth it, right? If you're that ill for that long. So anyway, he then goes on to say, I'm 120, right? Which means I'm going to die. And he says, I can no longer be active, right? So I can't go. He says the Hebrew is lo uchal od latzet v'lavo. I can no longer go out and come in, right? Now, when Moses dies, as we'll see at the the last thing in the book of Deuteronomy is the death of Moses. And we'll see that when he died, let me just find it. We'll be reading it, probably next week. Hold on. Right. So yeah, it says Moses died, and then it says Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were undimmed and his vigor unabated. Right. So here he's saying, I can't go out, I can't come in, but the actual description at the time of his death was that he was extremely vigorous, clear-sighted. So how do we understand that? And most commentaries say here, what he really means is he's going out and coming in is really about leading an army. And that's what Joshua is going to do, his successor. He's going to lead the army in. And he says, I no longer have the stamina, to be the commander in chief, as it were. So he says, the Lord has said to me, that is, God said to Moses, you shall not go across the Jordan, right? The Jordan is here, they are encamped, it's the edge of the promised land, and God has told him repeatedly, because of sin that he's committed, he doesn't get to go in. And then he says, the Lord your God will cross over before you, right? God is going to lead you, essentially. He himself will wipe out the nations from your path, and you shall dispossess them. And then it goes on to say, Joshua is the one who will cross before you. And if you look at the Hebrew language here, he says about God, hu over lifanecha. He will go before you, literally, hu over lifanecha. And then when it says about Joshua, it also says, hu over lifanecha. So it's the same language. And I'm pointing this out because if you look at verse 3, it says about God, he himself will wipe out the nations from your path, right? God himself will cross over. With Joshua, it simply says, Joshua is the one who will cross over, right? But the language in Hebrew is exactly the same. So the question really is, why is Joshua stuck here, right? And then if you look at verse 4, God will do to them as he did to Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, and he wiped them out, and then the Lord will deliver you, right? So Joshua is kind of stuck in here. God is the one who will go before you. And then afterwards, God is the one who will do all these things. I just got a question. We are on page 1173. 1173. So God is the one And yet Joshua is kind of stuck there in between. And this is what we saw also with Moses, that Moses is and is not the leader of the Jewish people. Most properly, God is the leader, right? And Moses is God's agent. And so there's a kind of mixing up, or I wouldn't say mixing ups, but rather a melding of the leadership of God and Moses. And we're going to see this also with Joshua, but we'll also see some differences, right? So Joshua is the one who will go before you as the Lord has spoken. And then the Lord, back to him again, or God again, I shouldn't say him, will do to them as he did to Sodom, to Sihon and Og, the king of the Amorites, when he wiped them out. The Lord will deliver them to you, and you shall deal with them in full accordance with the instruction that I've enjoined you. So God's going to lead you. Don't worry, just like Og and the Amorite, Sihon and Og, God will take care of it. And I've already told you how you are to deal with them. And then he says, Chisku ve'imsu, be strong and of good courage. What does it say? Be strong and resolute, right? This phrase, be strong and courageous, be strong and resolute, chazak v'amatz, here being directed to the whole people. In other words, be strong, because I will do this for you. Don't be afraid, right? Pursue this, press ahead. This phrase will be used again and again. It's used here several times. And when we turn to the book of Joshua, it won't be directed at the people as a whole, but at Joshua. It sort of means don't be faint-hearted. You can rely on me. The battle will go well. We also saw this somewhat earlier, this idea when we had the people were told exactly the same thing, though there was also military exemptions, right? God will fight for you, you will be victorious. And here too, but there we saw, if there's anyone who has planted a field and not reaped it, they're excused, right? If so, and we saw that about someone who's afraid and several other military exemptions. And it's worth noting, because if God is going to give you great victory, so why should people be afraid? Why should we need military exemptions? And I think the idea here is God is going to make you victorious, but people are going to die. In other words, warfare is what it is. The idea here that somehow they will go in and no one will die in this war is not what's being suggested here. It's rather you collectively will succeed. And in general, it says here, collectively, it's a plural. Chizku ve'imsu, you collectively be strong and resolute and not be in fear of them. But you might be fearful for your own life, and that was one of the exemptions. Okay, and then we again, God, right? The Lord your God, he is the one who marches with you, and God will not fail you and won't forsake you. And now, so that's Moses's introductory speech. Everybody is gathered. We're at the end of the Torah, this whole long process. And now Moses calls to Joshua in the sight of the entire people of Israel. So here we have the transfer of power, right? The next generation, and Moses is, in some sense, anointing God now. Of course not. God has anointed Moses, and Moses now anointing Joshua now in his new role as the leader of the people. And we saw elsewhere this, involves some kind of physical act, probably the laying of hands. In general, sort of this kind of thing, whether it was actually appointing a sacrifice in the time of the temple or here, transfer of leadership generally involves the laying of hands, which is interesting in itself, I think, because, when you talk about rabbis being ordained, right? And we often think about ordination as what happens to rabbis, but traditionally it's called smicha, right? And people have said to me, oh, where did you get your smicha, right? And I'd say, oh, JTS, right? So this idea of smicha, which in its sort of essence is about the laying on of hands, right? The generation of rabbis who comes before you, who have been your teachers, in a sense, commissions you, as Moses does to Joshua here, to assume position of leadership, not to replace them, but to assume a position of leadership. And here he says to Joshua, just what he said to the whole people: be strong and resolute, for it is you who shall go with this people into the land that the Lord swore to their fathers to give them, and it is you who shall apportion it to them, right? So Joshua is going to have two roles. One is that he is going to be the leader of the army, right? He is going to go with them into the land, but the other is that he's going to divide the land. Which tribes get which parts of the land? And that's really interesting, because this is a very different kind of responsibility. It takes a different kind of leadership. And you can well imagine the tribes having some issues. How come they get a bigger land than we get, right? Well, how come they get a more fertile land than we get, and so on. So this becomes, Joshua needs great authority to do this. And here, in the presence of all the people, even though he's not Moses, that authority has been transferred to him. And again, to Joshua, he says, the Lord will go before you. God will be with you. God will not fail you or forsake you. And then fear not and don't be dismayed. Okay. And now Moses writes down this teaching, and here we're talking, it says HaTorah Hazot, this teaching. This is the book of Deuteronomy, probably. Everything up to now, we've really come to the end of the book, and everything up to this point, he writes it down. He gives it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark, and to the elders of Israel, right? So the priests who carried the ark, who carried into battle, we already had the Aseret HaDibrot, right? We had the 10 Commandments, which were in this ark. We already had, actually, according to tradition, the broken tablets. Remember that there are two versions of the 10 Commandments. God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. Moses comes down. The people are cavorting around the golden calf. Moses takes the tablets and shatters them, deals with the golden calf, and then goes back up on Mount Sinai for another 40 days, where the second tablets are written, and Moses brings them down, and they also go into the ark. And that idea, of course, is what's behind the idea that we bury sacred objects when they're no longer usable, right? Put them in the ark, and very famously, just outside of Cairo, and it's now part of Cairo, Festat, where a Jewish community had taken documents for centuries and had put them in a storeroom, not in the ark, but they preserved them, which was fantastic because all kinds of lost works were discovered there. At any rate, here, in addition to the tablets that are in the ark, now the book of Deuteronomy is going into the ark. And so it's given to the tribe of Levi, and it's also given to the elders, because they will have a role in teaching the Torah to the people, right? So it's not the priests, but not the priests alone, it's also the elders. And now we get an instruction, and Moses instructed them as follows: every 7th year, which is Shnat HaShmitah, the sabbatical year, here it's the year of remission, at Sukkot, when Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place that God will choose, you will read this Torah aloud in the presence of all Israel. So every 7 years, the Torah, meaning probably the book of Deuteronomy, is supposed to be read publicly to all of Israel. This I read probably took somewhere between 3 and 4 hours. So imagine everybody standing there. It's Sukkot, lots of things are going on, lots of ceremonies are going on, and part of that is the reading of the Torah. There is no evidence that the Torah was publicly read in ancient times, other than this. There wasn't a weekly Torah reading or anything like that. It's not until the time of Ezra, which is the time, the Jews are exiled to Babylonia when the Babylonians come and destroy the temple. Ezra, the Babylonians are then conquered by the Persians, and the Persians let the Jews go back into the land of Israel. And one of the leaders then was Ezra, or as he was called, Ezra the scribe. And he is the one who institutes, according to tradition, the regular reading of the Torah, right? So this is it. It's probably only the book of Deuteronomy, and it's probably every 7 years. So why is it that the Sukkot, right, this harvest festival is chosen? Because it is the last festival of the year. So that means that the people really have done all of their harvesting. There's no longer anxiety about, between Pesach and Shavuot, there's anxiety. What will happen? What will the weather be? Will the crops be destroyed? They begin to be gathered then finally on Shavuot and by Sukkot, which was known as the most joyous festival of the year. And in fact, in rabbinic literature, it's called Hechag, the holiday, right? The big holiday, not Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but Sukkot, right? This is an enormously festive holiday, even though the Torah says that everyone was supposed to come on 3 pilgrimages a year. It's clear that they did not do that. The most people would come on Sukkot. And so it would be the best time to do this. And particularly in the sabbatical year, because remember that during the sabbatical year, you don't harvest, right? The field is supposed to just be left the way it is. You can go out, you can glean what's there and eat it. So this is a time when people really have leisure, and everyone is supposed to come. Here it says, to the place that God has chosen, right? And it will be read before the whole people and into their ears, right? Right. So it should penetrate, right? It's not just, I don't know about you, but there are times, even during the Torah reading, I have to say, it's being read, but how much of it is coming into my ears? I try to follow attentively, but so this here, right, every 7 years You got to make sure they get it, right? And then to make it even more clear, gather the people, men, women, and children, and the non-resident, the non-Jewish resident aliens, everyone should come, right, so that they can hear and learn to revere God and to observe every word of the teaching, right? So let's make it clear also, there are times when it's reasonable to argue that when the community is being addressed, they're really talking about men. For example, at the time that the Ten Commandments are given, it says Moses is talking to the people and telling them what they should do to prepare for the revelation. And I'm talking only in the Torah itself. Rabbinic literature finds everybody there at Mount Sinai. But the Torah, it says to the people, and don't sleep with your wives, right? Because that act will bring on some ritual impurity, and they therefore would not be in a position to fully experience this. Here, in counter-distinction, when the Torah is read, which includes, by the way, the Ten Commandments, right? The book of Deuteronomy, early on, we saw that everybody counts. Everybody has to be there. Everyone has to hear it, including, and this is specific, the children who have not had the experience, right? This is one of the Torah's most basic concerns, passing things on to the next generation who doesn't know. And it's all over the book of Exodus. One of the things it says about this, the Exodus, is you need to teach your children about this. They don't know, right? And we're going to have a Seder every year, according to the book of Exodus. And when your child asks, you should tell them that this is what God did, right? Again and again. And here too, it should be foundational for those who did not directly experience. They shall learn and hear and revere God as long as they live in the land that you are about to cross. So Moses here is talking about the people in the land. What if they're not in the land? Right, it's a worthwhile question. Now, the audience that Moses is addressing is going to be in the land. What if they're not? And it's an interesting question because there are a fair number of laws in the Torah which really only apply in the land of Israel. The sabbatical year, which I just mentioned, which is when the Torah is read every 7 years, only in the land of Israel. Outside the land of Israel, you can plant your crops, you can harvest them even in the 7th year. And that's one reason why people in Israel who are very strict about the sabbatical year, there are workarounds, but they don't accept them. So they want to get their produce from Europe, for example, because in Europe, there's no obligation to follow the sabbatical year. All the laws of sacrifice, there's a whole lot. We say there are 613 commandments, but actually there are fewer in the Torah itself, which obligates people if they don't live in Israel. If it's about sacrifice, doesn't obligate you at all since the temple is destroyed and so on. But here, the assumption is that they will be in the land, and as long as they live, you have to keep teaching them. Okay. Now God says to Moses, all right, you're about to die, right? Very few of us get to know this with some exactitude, but Moses does. And he says, call Joshua to the tent of meeting that I may instruct him. This is a really striking phrase, because who has God been speaking to up to now? it's Moses. This is really dramatically about the transfer of power. Now, we've seen in several places in the Torah that Moses is not happy about the fact that he doesn't get to go into the promised land and that he is going to die. And there are these wonderful midrashim, these rabbinic fantasies, I would call them, trying to imagine what happens at this point. And according to the midrash, Moses pleads with God, and he says, I don't want to die, and God, let Joshua take over. I'll just be there. I'll serve Joshua, right? So God says, according to the midrash, okay. And then Joshua goes in to meet with God, and Moses says, oh, what did God tell you? And Joshua says very pointedly to Moses, when God spoke to you, did you tell me what God said? Right? I have to say, rabbis really identify with this moment because many rabbis have an emeritus, right? There is the rabbi emeritus who is no longer the rabbi exactly. You are, but it's not, it can be sometimes a sort of fraught relationship, right? Because it's hard to accept, and it's hard for people to accept that you are the rabbi and that person is no longer the one they turn to in times of distress, the one who will do the bar mitzvahs and the weddings, and right, and all of that. So this is a tough transition, and we get this sense of Moses in this rabbinic story, and Joshua's rebuke, right? No, you're not the guy anymore. And then the fantasy goes on, and Moses says, all right, I'll just be Joshua's servant. And now the scene is Joshua is in the tent, right? And Moses is attending to him, right? Seeing to his needs, right? As Joshua had attended to Moses. And people come and they see this and they are outraged that Moses is being treated like this, that Moses should be a servant to Joshua, and they rebel, right? How dare you treat him like this, right? All of this to show Moses that his time is done. They say there's a famous midrash about the sun and the moon, right? And initially they are the same size, and then God shrinks the moon. Rashi says a king cannot wear two crowns. The time of Moses as that crown has passed. Joshua is here. One more rabbinic midrash about this, because I love them. Moses is told that he's going to die. What does Moses do? He starts frantically writing Torah scrolls. You're right. He writes what? And the midrash gives some number, I don't know, 30, 70, whatever it is, that one after another, because he thinks that if he's engaged in this holy activity, God can't interfere, right? There's this idea that if you're doing a mitzvah, the angel of death can't get to you somehow, right? But gets interrupted, he loses his concentration. Anyway, okay. So he says to Moses, call Joshua, present yourself that I may instruct him. And Moses and Joshua went, present themselves at the tent of meeting. The Lord appears in the tent in a pillar of cloud, having come to rest at the entrance to the tent. And God says to Moses, you are soon to lie with your fathers, right? And the Hebrew is shochev im avotecha. Shochev is literally to lie. Right? So this image of lying with your ancestors or being gathered to your ancestors is clearly not about being in the same cemetery, right? You could say, and we see that kind of with Abraham, right? That he purchases the cave of Machpelah and he is buried there, and Sarah is buried there, right? And Isaac and Rebecca. So, this idea of having a family plot, as it were, is not what's meant here, because Moses is not going to die. Moses is dying in the wilderness, right? He's not going to go to the cave of Machpelah. So what does it mean? I think the idea here is literally that we join our ancestors in the next world, that we are, and it's I think, a very beautiful image, that our family is never lost to us, that eventually we will see them again, be together with them again. And I think that this phrase, to lie with your ancestors or to be gathered to your ancestors, really does suggest that you'll be together. Now, where you'll be together? Are we talking about in the Bible? It's kind of Sheol, it's this underworld. Is it Gan Eden? Are you going to be in paradise together? Right? The Torah is very unclear, and Jews over millennia have had different ideas about what happens after we die. There's no, except that we don't disappear. We're not nothing. Something happens. And apparently, when that happens, we're together with the family that we have lost before us. And I would add that our children and our grandchildren will eventually join us there too, which I find a very beautiful image. And then God says, after you die, the people will go astray after alien gods in their midst, in the land they are about to enter. They will forsake me and break my covenant that I made with them. My anger will flare against them, and I will abandon them. Well, so this is not what Moses certainly wants to hear. It's not what Joshua wants to hear either. And it really raises a question. It's a question you see in the book of Exodus too, with respect to Pharaoh. What about free will? God is God ordaining this? I think it's not free will. It's an assessment of human nature. Right? And it's also, and Moses will say the same thing, it's also based on experience. This is, and they're referred to later as Am Kashei Oref, a stiff-necked people, stubborn in their ways. So here, when this happens, God is saying, I will be angry and I will abandon them. And this is kind of what we would say in modern Hebrew, or even Rabbinic Hebrew, midah keneged midah, measure for measure. Sometimes people say what goes around comes around. They abandoned me, I will abandon them. And then this phrase is used, vihistarti fanai, I will hide my face. It's really an interesting image, right? I will hide my face from them. I will look away from them. And when I do, they will become ready prey, and many evils and troubles will befall them. Right? So this idea of hester panim, hiding the face, people, when they talk about the Shoah, talk about it in religious terms as a time of hester panim, that God had turned away from the people. The opposite of Hester Panim is what we see in the Birkat Kohanim, right? The threefold blessing that the people are to give, the priests, I'm sorry, are to give the people of Israel. We read about it in the Shema, right? Yivarecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God, guard you and protect you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha, and may God cause God's face to shine upon you. Yisa Adonai, may God lift up God's countenance, right? So God's countenance lifting up to you is the opposite of this Hester Panim, this turning away. And the consequence, once God is not looking after you, as you were, then you will say, surely it is because the Lord our God is not in our midst that these evils have befallen us. Now, you could say, and then it says, yet I will keep my countenance hidden because of the evil they have done in turning to other gods. So this looks a little bit like they're repenting, right? And therefore, why isn't God accepting their repentance? And I think if you look at what they're not saying that we were wrong to follow other gods. They're saying God isn't here with us to protect us, right? In other words, we didn't do anything wrong, but we lost God and the consequences of losing God. It's somewhat similar to God's face being, God turning God's face from them, God's hiding God's countenance. And therefore, God says to Moses, therefore, write down this poem and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths in order that this poem may become witness against the people of Israel. So what is the poem? Well, we're going to read a poem, and we'll do that next time, Moses's final poem. But I think what's being referred to here is probably not the poem, but actually the book of Deuteronomy itself. There is this idea that the Torah is itself a kind of poetry, right? And it's not merely something literal that one can expound on it and so on, because what does it mean to say that it will be a witness against the people? And I think the idea is that the Torah contains the covenant. And because it contains the covenant, it shows what they should be doing, and it testifies that they've broken that covenant. At any rate, what does it say? Put it in their mouths. And that seems to be, to put something in someone's mouth, seems to be an idiom for have them memorize it. The injunction here is that everybody should memorize it, everybody should remember it. Actually, this idiom is used in other ancient Semitic languages, in Akkadian and in Sumerian. It also talks about putting something in someone's mouth as enjoining that they memorize it. And when I bring them into the land flowing with milk and honey, I promised as an oath to their fathers, and they eat their fill, and they grow fat, and they turn to other gods. The idea is, once they are affluent, there's abundance, they don't feel they need God anymore. They're sort of filled with themselves. That's when people turn. And serve them, spurning me, breaking my covenant, and many evils and troubles will fall on them. This poem will confront them as a witness, since it will never be lost from the mouth of their offspring. For I know what plans they are devising even now. It's not just when they get into the already among the people, there are murmurings of disloyalty. And seems reasonable if you look at the history of the Jews in the wilderness. They're constantly rebelling, seeking other gods, being ensnared by idolatry. I know they're doing this already, and it says, and Moses wrote this down before the Israelites, and God charged Joshua, the son of Nun, be strong and resolute, for you will bring the Israelites into the land that I promised you on oath, and I will be with you. And this is actually the first time that God speaks directly to Joshua, not to Moses. Moses is done. And Moses put down in the writing of the words of this teaching to the very end, charged the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of teaching, again, we're talking about Deuteronomy, place it in the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, let it remain there as a witness against you, right? This idea that there is a treaty, and when the written treaty is violated, it becomes a witness. There's a story, another ancient Sumerian, ancient parallel. It comes from a people called the Hittites. There's a story about the Hittites that there's a plague. Why are we being plagued? And there's an oracle who directs them, and they find 2 tablets, interestingly enough, in that story, which was a covenant between their God, right, and the Hittites, and it proves that they had broken the law, and hence the covenant has been broken and the plague has come upon them. We see this same idea much later in Jewish history during the period of kings. King Josiah, in a period of idolatry, King Josiah, during the repairs to the temple, finds a book, and it leads to an enormous transformation of the Jewish people, tremendous reforms among the Jewish people, putting them back on the path to repentance and righteousness. And there too, it's a kind of book that testifies against them. Probably scholars think the book of Deuteronomy. We're just about out of time. Okay. I know this is Moses speaking now. How defiant and stiff-necked you are, even now, while I'm still alive. You've been defiant towards the Lord. How much more then when I am dead? Right? In Hebrew, this is called the kol v'chomer in rabbinic language. If this, how much more so? Right? So here Moses is, in a sense, saying, hey, I'm the one who talked to God face to face. I'm the one who brought you the tablets. I'm the one who led you out of Egypt. You did this while I was in charge. How much more so when Joshua is in charge? Gather to me the elders of your tribes, your officials, that I may speak these words to you, and I may call heaven and earth to witness against them. For I know that when I'm gone, you will act wickedly, turn away from the path, and in time to come, misfortune will befall you because you have done evil in the sight of the Lord and vexed him by his deeds. Then the Lord recited the words of this poem to the very end. We're going to see the poem next week. It's a really down ending, I have to say. It is a really down ending to this book. And we're going to see that this sense of pessimism about the people's future is going to continue right through the last 2 chapters. I'll have more to say about that next week, as probably we will finish the study of Deuteronomy. We still have some time left. Any questions anyone has, comments about anything that we've looked at today or anything else? I know it's a lot, and I haven't paused in between, so, Marilyn. And then Saul,
I just wanted to know where Joshua came from.
so Joshua is one of the leaders of the people, one of the chieftains among the people. He actually his name originally was Hoshea ben Nun, Hoshea the son of Nun. He served Moses, who changed his name to Joshua, to Yehoshua ben Nun. He is there from the beginning, and he is one of the scouts when Moses sends scouts into the land to advertise how beautiful it is and how they'll be able to conquer it. And the scouts come back and they say, yeah, beautiful, but they're going to destroy us. And the people become disheartened and don't want to go in. Joshua is one of only two people who do not, he gives a positive report, and he is rewarded with being able to enter the promised land. So he's there from the beginning. He's Moses' servant. He has an important role through the story as a chieftain, here as a leader of his tribe. Here, he takes over.
Was he a family member?
So he is not a family member. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because what we don't have here is hereditary leadership. So thank you for pointing it out. We're going to have it when there's a king, right? David's son Solomon will follow him. It'll break off the king before David, the first king of Israel, Saul, will leave the scene, and David will become the new king, and then it will be hereditary after that. Saul.
Yeah, I noticed in the Hebrew there's a lot of singular and there's a lot of plural here in the second person.
Yes, because God is speaking. So God is speaking to the people, speaking also to an individual, meaning Moses, an individual, meaning Joshua. Moses is also speaking sometimes in the singular, sometimes in the plural. Hard to know why that distinction is made. Some scholars think that the singular is sometimes used for the plural, and in those contexts, it means the plural. That's about as much as I can tell you about that. Francesca.
I'm impressed with how angry and frustrated Moses is, understandably, about losing power.
Yes, I think you can add, you've got one thing after another. He loses his sister, he loses his brother, who were the leadership team. He's not going to be allowed to go into the promised land. He actually has to see his successor as taking over. So frustration and bitterness.
Oh,
And
very
I
much so.
would even go further if you want to look at this on purely human terms. You think that guy
It's going to be any better than me?
can do what I did, right? Right? I mean, it's not a pretty picture of Moses in that sense. Or we can look at it, in a different sense, in that Moses is really, really worried about this people. And
He is worried, but I also hear a sense of betrayal. Look at all the shit I put up with all these years, God, and look, and how you're doing me wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sense of betrayal, and working through that, we really see much earlier. Moses by this point seems to have come to some acceptance.
Not quite. I think he's on the road. I disagree with you. I don't think he's accepted
Okay.
yet at this point.
We'd have to
He
look at
doesn't-
specific passages really to tease that apart.
Well, when he says, I'd rather be dead than be jealous and watching someone other take over the reins. At that point, I know he's had some acceptance, but he has to have the outburst first.
But remember, so that is not really Moses. That's the Midrash. That's a rabbinic fantasy.
Oh, I didn't know
But
that.
I
Okay, thanks for
think-
clarifying.
I think that the rabbis are saying what you're saying. Right. In other words, as they look at this story, and they look at it from a variety of ways, and some of it is psychological.
Of course.
When they tell that story, I think that part of it, right, part of it is about coming to accept the loss of his leadership, and not feeling good about it.
No.
But ultimately, in the end, we'll see it. God tells Moses, go up on that mountain, you're going to die. And Moses accepts that. Comes.
Yeah, at that point,
Okay.
yes.
And we'll see in some sense God's reward to him probably next week. Anything else?
Thank you.
All right. Well, this has been great. I urge you
Yes.
to begin finding yourself, thinking about where you might find a copy of the book of Joshua. Again, I recommend in particular Robert Altman. You might be, if you go perhaps to Amazon. I don't know this is the case, but you might go to Amazon and look for Joshua and Altman. Search that, you might find it. But again, you can use anything. You can use the Sonsino translation. You can have just a Bible. And I'll be working through the Hebrew. So take your pick. Sandy, go ahead.
Rabbi, is it Robert Alter?
Yes, that's what I said.
You said Altman.
I'm sorry.
I thought you said Altman.
Alter.
Right.
Alter. Maybe I slipped.
I just wanted to clarify for her.
No, I'm glad you did. Robert Alter, T-E-R. Thank you. Thank you for being there with that. Okay, so have a great week.
Enjoy the snow.
I look forward to seeing you, and I don't know. It's 2 chapters, but I have a feeling we'll get through it all. See you then.
Okay.
Thank you,
bye.
Rabbi.
Thank you.